Okay, so I think we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to day 2 of London Open Research Week. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope you enjoyed Sam Moore's fantastic keynote yesterday. We're really looking forward to the rest of the week's events. I'm Carly Lightfoot and I'm the Scholarly Communications Manager at the University of East London. This event is a collaboration between University of East London, Birkbeck, Greenwich and London South Bank University. You can join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag LORW. So we'll crack on for today's event. So we've got 2 excellent speakers for you. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat box. We'll also open the floor at the end of each talk, where you can also have the opportunity to turn on your mic and ask a question if you wish. As with all sessions during Open Research Week, the session will be recorded, and that does include any questions that may be asked. So if you don't wish to appear on the recording, then please do just use the comment function and we'll ensure that your question is asked anonymously. Just a note that you can enable the live captions on the Teams desktop, and that's just by clicking the More Options button, which is the one with the 3 dots, and then select Turn on Live Captions. So first up, we've got Arthur A.J. Boston with the excellently titled Kanye West Explains Scholarly Communication. AJ is a scholarly communication librarian at Murray State University and MSU Office of Research and Creative Activities Coordinator. His writings and presentations incorporate popular culture to make scholarly communication more accessible. He's outgoing Library Publishing Coalition Fellow and incoming Spark COAPI Steering Committee member and KYVL Affordable Learning Steering Committee member. And you can find AJ on Twitter at AJ_Boston. So over to you, AJ.
Awesome, thank you. Let me get my screen shared here. All right, can everybody hear me?
Can indeed.
All right, cool, I'll get started. Thank you, Carly, and the rest of the planning committee for the invitation and opportunity to speak here during London Open Research Week. It's my great honor to serve today as a warm-up act for Madeleine Pownall. And unfortunately, Kanye West will not be joining us to explain scholarly communication. But if you don't mind, I've planned a few slides of my own. As Carly said, I'm AJ Boston, and I do scholarly communication here at Murray State University. So, when I say that Kanye West explains scholarly communication, I don't mean that he literally explains it. Although I can point to his actual public comments that do directly speak to our concerns, like OER, or to his lyrics that speak directly to how I have sometimes felt trying to get published in peer-reviewed journals. What I mean to say is that Kanye's way of being an artist, a creator of content that has transitioned from physical to streaming formats, as someone who has relied on a label to distribute his music to relevant venues, the way he expressly sought to be signed with the most prestigious label of the genre as a young artist, this explains scholarly communication. The way he tests out ideas with colleagues in private, tests them out further with colleagues in public settings, the way he's not immune to criticism and online comments, not immune to both competition and collaboration with peers. This has all helped explain scholarly communication to me over the years. So hip hop and rap creators are subject to similar structures as creators of academic scholarship, whether it's reporting scientific findings or recording a track. Both of these end products are fixed in a tangible format and are therefore under copyright. Both groups create for an audience, and if they want to maximize their audience size, often they'll rely on distribution channels like a middleman or a label to do the work of making the content findable by the appropriate audience, to get put on the library shelf, the retail store shelf, to be findable by EBSCOhost, by Web of Science, on Spotify's New Music Friday playlist. In exchange for a label or publisher distributing this content to the maximally sized appropriate audience, these creators are often asked to sign over their author's rights or license some part of their copyright to a middleman, and a middleman that uses this exclusive right to maximize their profit because this is their business. In a previous era, pre-web, an aspiring artist or scholar did not have a strong practical choice in the matter, given the structure of the systems of distribution. Today, an artist or scholar who wants to remain near maximally independent while still finding an audience can choose to upload their preprints to somewhere like bioRxiv or Humanities Commons, or their mixtape and loosies to SoundCloud, DatPiff, Bandcamp, and then rely on social media and other less formal channels to get the message across. We're still in a sort of transition period where some scholars and artists are operating in a digital online world, but maybe they began their career prior to the mainstreaming of all the onlineness. And they're finding ways to bridge the gap between those 2 points in their life, now that they can reclaim some control over their prior works. So take Taylor Swift, the famous rap star Taylor Swift. She signed to a label, Big Machine, when she was a teenager, and her original contract specified that the master recordings of her music would be owned by the label. Recently, Big Machine sold these recordings against her wishes to Scooter Braun. But here's the cool thing about music copyright. There's copyright over the recordings of the music, and there's copyright over the songwriting, like the lyrics and musical composition. Swift's deal had her retain copyright over her songwriting, and Big Machine just got the actual recorded music. So you can think of Swift's deal as a sort of proto-rights retention strategy. So what you may have seen lately is Swift re-recording her back catalog and releasing these as Taylor's versions. And she's re-recording these classic albums largely in hopes that the fans, the stans, and other groups who would seek to license her music in different formats would choose the Taylor's versions over the Scooter's versions. So I mentioned this for 2 reasons. First, I think it's funny to interrupt my Kanye talk with Taylor Swift content. So justice for Taylor, I'm gonna let you finish. And 2, a big chunk of working researchers are career-wise sort of in this Taylor Swift generation of publishing. Maybe they began their careers publishing papers, feeling beholden to chase authorship and outlets based on the prestige of those outlets and in consideration of how that might translate back to their career goals, or at least the incentives they felt would get them there, but now find themselves wanting to take more control over the distribution by making previously paywalled articles open access. And rather than paying thousands of dollars in article processing fees to go gold away, they go the green route, where they deposit their postprints into open access repositories. The postprint, or author's accepted manuscript, that's the final version of the article that's been through peer review, but not yet been through the publisher's copy editing, formatting, and the like. The author's versions, much like Taylor's versions, are versions that the creator is able to take back a degree of control over, especially in expanding how it is put out. However, an author's version or postprint implies that there's a publisher's version, situation in which creators wish to exert further control that the publishers did not directly provide. That implies that the author and publisher did not see eye to eye to begin with. If an author wants to control when a piece is made available or what goes into it, they may decide to preprint first. For authors who wish to publish in a journal that does not require payment either from them or for the reader, an author may choose to publish in a diamond open access journal. One way I like to think about this is with the example of Kanye's protege, Chance the Rapper. In 2016, Chance released his 3rd album quality mixtape called Coloring Book. Coloring Book was available for free on sites like DatPiff and SoundCloud. In fact, you couldn't buy a copy of it. It was only available as a free download. It was not for sale. And in a lot of ways, Coloring Book was just about as close to an open access album as possible. I think equally important, or slightly more important than the fact that the album was free, is the reasons it was free. It wasn't a compliance issue from a funder or institutional policy. It was because he wanted it that way. So I'm going to read you 2 quotes. One's from Chance the Rapper, and the other is from Randy Sheckman, a Nobel winner who quit his post as editor at a closed access journal to start up an open access journal that would rival the other journal. And what I think you'll hear in these two quotes is something of the same vibe. Sheckman: a paper can become highly cited because it is good science, or because it is eye-catching, provocative, or wrong. Luxury journal editors know this, so they accept papers that will make waves because they explore sexy subjects or make challenging claims. This influences the science that scientists do. There is a better way, through the new breed of open access journals that are free for anybody to read and have no expensive subscriptions to promote. Born on the web, they can accept all papers that meet quality standards with no artificial caps. Chance: after I made my second mixtape and gave it away online, my plan was to sign with a label and figure out my music from there. But after meeting with the 3 major labels, I realized my strength was being able to offer my best work to people without any limit on it. I honestly believe if you put effort into something and you execute properly, you don't necessarily have to go through the traditional ways. Here, Chance says that you don't necessarily have to go through traditional outlets, not that you can't. And Sheckman didn't protest the peer review process. His own journal is peer-reviewed. He protests the business model, which incentivizes editorial models that seek flashy, positive findings and drive 90% rejection rates, which waste everybody's time, effort, and money. Chance released his album for free, but that didn't stop him from seeking success. He simply wanted to maximize his artistic freedom and the choices he made with his music, and to not limit the number of listeners with paywalls. But none of this was out of alignment with his career goals. He won a Grammy that year, but he did have to jump through some creative hoops to be eligible for that Grammy nomination. At the time of his album release, the Grammy rules said that to be eligible for nomination, an album must have become available for sale during the past year. And of course, this album was not for sale. So Chance kind of split the difference. The solution he came up with was to put his album on Apple's new music subscription service exclusively for 2 weeks, where listeners could technically pay in order to listen to the album, but if a listener didn't wish to pay, there was still plenty of legal and artist-approved routes to do so. What I want to emphasize is Chance's creative approach to dealing with a silly rule, which enabled him to meet compliance, but still ultimately was able to stick to his original objective of artistic freedom and literal album price freedom. I think many of you can probably empathize with dealing with silly rules when it comes to research and the credit accrued for it. I think researchers, especially grads seeking jobs or current faculty seeking to keep their jobs, can do more to be like Chance. Publish in Diamond open access outlets, deposit your postprints, do things to get credit from gatekeepers if you must, but then do what you can to ensure the potential audience does not have a gatekeeper of their own in turn. If you're an editor or senior ranking academic with an ability to change things, move to be more accepting of researchers who post preprints first or only. Try out new models like what eLife began last year, where they no longer accept manuscripts for review unless they've already been deposited as preprints on an open access server or archive. Okay, so at this point, you probably see some of the clear similarities between creators of scholarly content and the arts, such as music. But this talk is about one particular rapper, how he explains scholarly communications. So before I drill down to Kanye in particular, let me just take a moment to mention that hip hop, of all music, is the perfect genre to use. They've known this in English departments for decades, how sample-based music provides a perfect analogy to introduce the tradition and idea of citation and quotation in writing classrooms. Hip hop is also very good these days because of rappers' use of mixtape sites to freely circulate albums without label control. DJs and producers, they often release stem packs and drum kits, which are full of samples and sounds they've created or they've cut or created live. That other DJs and producers can download and reuse however they see fit. A practice which I've compared to researchers putting their code, methods, and data sets in places like OSF, where other researchers can download, inspect, and rerun for themselves. I think the most common way people think about parallels with music is with piracy, where peak CD cost in the 90s and Napster stand in for the serials crisis and Sci-Hub. And if all that sounds familiar, it's because we've kind of talked that one into the ground. So I don't want to dwell too much there. Instead, let's talk about Kanye's rollout for his 7th album, The Life of Pablo. First, he played a version of this album on a Friday at Madison Square Garden. He performed slightly different versions of 2 tracks the next day on Saturday Night Live. Then early on Sunday, a still slightly different version of his final album was released. But even after the official release, he kept tweaking the album, and it seemed fine and normal to present alternate versions of songs ahead of the album release, sort of like how a scholar might present a draft of a paper at a conference and use feedback gotten there to improve the final product. But Kanye was adding Frank Ocean verses here and dropping Vic Mensa verses there and adding new songs after the final album was said to have been released. And it got kind of messy, especially for those talking about the album in the culture, on blogs, and in professional music criticism. If you wrote about the album on day one, you'd often have to go back a week later to note the changes or otherwise risk a disconnect in the minds of future readers. And this is something that really spoke to me about issues in publishing, like when a journal might issue a change or withdrawal to an article, which perhaps may have already been cited by subsequent papers. Early, I spoke about posting preprints, and even this has a potential to get messy in a similar way, such as when an author has preprints that sit alongside publishers' versions of articles, which might vary in their content. Some people have suggested that in these cases, the best practice is to cite only the publisher's so-called version of record. Others, noting that sometimes people are choosing to cite a preprint version, want to keep a more comprehensive scholarly record intact. And rather than obsess over version of record, they say what is needed is the development of mechanisms to deal with the record of versions. There's been some good momentum in this space recently. BioArchive now allows you to follow preprints, which will send you alerts anytime a change takes place. And Zotero now alerts you when any article you've saved in your library becomes retracted, and so on. So right now, I have a minor piece in a journal that's been available since September 7th. Today is October 26th, and it's been available as an in-press corrected proof. And somehow it's not technically published. So on the one hand, I'm incredibly relieved to have it out there and available. But on the other hand, I'm still waiting to be able to claim it for the year. I should mention this is not a Diamond OA outlet or library published journal, but I do have my postprint ready to roll. Instead, this is a journal that's closed access, and they have a journal impact factor listed right there on their homepage. Journal impact factor, of course, is that number reflecting the yearly mean number of citations of articles published in the last 2 years in a given journal, as indexed by Clarivate's Web of Science. I like referring to it as Clarivate's Web of Science. It's very exact. It's sort of like saying Dr. Frankenstein's monster rather than just Frankenstein. Anyway, the more citations a journal's articles receive within that set period of time, the better it works out for their impact factor to rise. And a lot of people supportive of Dora and Leiden, would prefer this whole thing just disappear because of its potential and proven ability to distort the scientific record by giving journals an incentive to favor the publication of article types that are prone to citation, leaving out other types of worthy content from the scholarly record. But to return to my article, which is available to read without technically being published, I like to call this the hotline bling strategy. So one of the other big rap albums to come out in 2016 was Views by Kanye's frenemy Drake. Just 2 years prior to its release, the Billboard 200 had changed their algorithm to better account for streaming. The Billboard 200 is sort of like the impact factor of music. Sure, an album may be a top 10 record for the week, but does that mean it's any good? So Billboard changed their algorithm so that when tracks from an album received a designated number of plays, that would be counted as one album equivalent sold. So Drake, a guy who likes to be number one, puts out a very bloated 17-track album. And to top it off, he tosses on the nearly year-old Hotline Bling as a bonus track. Hotline Bling was ubiquitous for a while. And previous to its inclusion on this album, on its own for the past year, it had accrued 573 million streams. So by the time Views drops, the album really had no other choice but to go to number one. So thank you for my journal for putting out my article well ahead of its actual publication, but I know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and it's kind of greasy. So just think, if a journal puts out articles for months in advance of their publication, they're creating artificially perfect conditions to boost the number of citations that occur in the eligible 2-year time window that impact factor calculates. Coloring book views and the life of Pablo, these are all examples from 2016, but we're in 2021 now, and all the things I've mentioned so far still hold up very well. I've been thinking about things in this way for a while, and so I put that lens on everything I come across in music now. Kanye had held 3 different listening parties in advance of his most recent album, Donda, all of which featured pretty different versions of the album. His in-house producer, Mike Dean, noted how Kanye was using the live feedback to help guide decisions, and it's stuffed with 27 tracks, of which he's already been cutting and adding features on again. The live stream events were Apple Music exclusives, and both the events and the album had, at the time, broken Apple's streaming records for the year. Bjorn Brims had this great tweet in September where he said, "Citations are not a proxy for quality. If they were, I would have become a better researcher in 2018. Instead, I published a controversial paper as one of 70 authors." I really appreciate Brim's candor because it made me think about Donda's streaming success, about all the factors that are helping to boost the quantitative measures that come together to give Donda this picture of success. The way it's been built for streaming with its 27 tracks, 30 featured artists, and controversial figures attached to the project. At the second listening party for Donda, fans went nuts because Jay-Z was featured on a song called Jail. The 2 artists had not been on a track together in a long time, but at the third listening event, Kanye dropped Jay-Z from the song and added DaBaby, who had just made some pretty horrific homophobic comments at a concert, and Marilyn Manson, who'd been credibly accused of abuse by several women. So I know Kanye was trying to feature these 2 figures in keeping with the album's theme of redemption. And I do think folks should be allowed the opportunity to seek public redemption, but these 2, they had not yet, sought to earn this in any meaningful way. So Kanye has to know this sort of controversy probably contributes to the album's overall streaming numbers, but it leaves a sour taste in my mouth on an album I otherwise quite like. Now, on the final album that is on streaming services, the version of Jail featuring Jay-Z is the one that's listed on the album proper. At the end of the album, the version of Jail featuring DaBaby is included and named Jail Part 2. And I would have preferred this alternate track did not exist at all, but I'm somewhat thankful that if it must, it's been done in a way that's very convenient to omit from my headspace. When the final track on Donda plays before Jail 2, Part 2, I stop and I move on to something else. In this way, I don't hear DaBaby, and more importantly, perhaps, Spotify knows I've not played it. The record label sees data that it's not been played when the rest of the album has, and the algorithms and decision makers get some sense from my account that DaBaby is not being rewarded, which in turn means his music is less likely to appear as a recommendation for me on Spotify, on the overall listening charts, and on Spotify curated playlist. The point for me is that the way that song plays operate in the music industry now mostly centered around streaming, really quite same way that citations tend to work in our mostly online publishing and algorithmically based discovery systems. The more citations an article receives earlier on, the higher it will display in a Google Scholar search result, and thus gain further citations still. As scholars, we have a choice about who and what to cite in our own work, and these choices have real ramifications we should consider. Ramifications about whose voices are counted, who's left out of the conversation, whose positions of power are reified, and the knowledge types we accept or overlook. I won't give a lecture on citational politics here. It's out of my expertise, and I'm probably getting near time. I simply want to point out that for audiences who have not thought about or not thought very deeply about citational politics, an example like whether to stream someone like DaBaby or R. Kelly or any other number of musicians may be a good introduction to that topic. And rather than diving right into the scholarly weeds, this topical sort of discussion might more quickly move things toward understanding. And really, that's the sort of point and purpose behind all of the examples we've gone over today. Even the field of discussion for newcomers to this space, whether it's students, early career researchers, the public, whoever. Scholarly communication can be a pretty intimidating and overwhelming space to enter into, but it doesn't have to be. The conversation doesn't have to be about Kanye or rap or even music. It can be video games, pro wrestling, news reporting. All these spaces have creators, mediators, incentives, economics, metrics, and anyone who has a deep personal interest in these spaces is bound to have intuitions, ideas and experiences that they can use as an entry point into the scholarly calm space. And more importantly, bring different sort of thinking to our long-standing, evolving, and brand new dilemmas. I'm very curious to know what are the other domains that you've drawn on when thinking about things like publishing, open access, responsible metrics. What are the industries that you think have gotten things right that scholarship distribution still struggles with? Who are the creators and artists you admire and why? What can you do in your own work as scholars to better achieve ideals you admire in others? Thank you for your time. I realize I've gone a little bit over time, so I'll cede my Q&A time back to Maddie, but thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, AJ. That was awesome. So we've got a few minutes that we can take questions. So again, feel free to pop them in the chat box or go ahead and raise your hands, and we'll take questions from the floor. Whilst you're deciding what to ask, I'll jump in with one myself. So just wondering if you can see sort of the publishing or Skolcom's sort of industry continuing to have parallels with the record labels or music industry, or do you think there will be any sort of diversions in business practices between the two?
Like I said, I really continue to see a lot of parallels between the two. Like I said, every time something new happens in music, I can't help but think of some parallel that's currently happening in the Skolcom space.
And I guess we sort of, there's an idealistic kind of thought that open research practices might be able to fix or, you know, kind of revolutionize corporate publishing. I don't know if you see sort of any sort of sentiment there in the music industry, or what kind of those so-called open practices might work for that.
I'm trying to, let's see if I can understand that question. So yeah, I think when I talk about Kanye West, he's absolutely a capitalist. He's a billionaire. He's trying to make money. There are definitely other types of hip hop, underground hip hop, that really are pushing against that money-making narrative. They're trying to, where money does change hands, it's on a very peer-to-peer basis. It's direct from the audience, and the fans to the artist. Things like Bandcamp exist, where artists can put their music directly up for sale, and you can listen to it for free, where you can kind of pick your own price and send a buck to them. And I think that there is something to be learned from that.
Awesome. So anyone else feel free to jump in with a question. Okay, David, go ahead and open your mic. Are you there, David? Okay, in the meantime, we've got a question from the chat box. Are early career researchers caught in a bind where they want to be open and innovative, but need to publish traditionally to get a permanent contract?
I don't think so at all. I think, like I was talking about with the Chance the Rapper and post prints, if you need to publish somewhere that's fancy and closed, you can do that. Just be sure to put your post print in a repository afterward. Or a lot of places are allowing you to post a preprint. Let's say you have a work that is under consideration at a journal, but it's not yet published, and you're trying to apply for a job right now. I've seen people suggest that you put it on somewhere like OSF, and then I'm not sure how you do it, but you designate it as read only. And so if you wanted to send that work, make it readable only to a potential job, I think that's something that you could do.
David, have we got you here now?
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully this time. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I just want to say, well, one, that was an excellent talk, and it's given me so much to think about in sort of analogies like that. My question is about how there's platforms now like Patreon for content providers, which allows you to subscribe, to additional content and to background information. I'm wondering if the analogy can be extended towards that in some way. Maybe not subscribing to individual researchers, but giving credit directly to them in some way to allow researchers to pursue things without having to worry about credit in some way, or impact, or audience attention, something along those lines where we we can thank them directly.
Yeah, I guess you could set up an I was about to say OnlyFans. I guess you could set up a Patreon if you wanted, if people wanted to express appreciation for the research that you do, but they don't necessarily have a paper or something where they can cite you. I think that's a perfectly fine thing to do. And I think maybe we want to make research and scholarship as open as possible, but that there's times where that's not actually preferable. And I guess in those cases, like maybe you have indigenous knowledge, and maybe that might possibly be a good time to use something like Patreon. I've not thought that one through, so let's strike that from the record.
Right, I think we got time for one more question. So we've got one in the chat. So really interesting correlation, especially in relation to industry and data harvesting to inform platform practices. The DIY approach has similarities in some aspects of scholar-led OA. A possible failure of that type of approach may be not challenging the usage of data and platform dominance, perhaps.
So I think there's some really data, like listening data and music. It's really a double-edged sword. The artists need to have that data, and the best way to get it is through those mass platforms, and that can sometimes be used against them, but a lot of times that really helps them. Let's say you're a band and you have an album that's going to go out and you want to go on tour to promote it. Maybe you're a brand new band and you're not sure where to go. You can use like that music data to see where your music is being played geographically, and kind of plan your tour around that. But I can see other cases where, if your music is more niche, that can get, maybe your overall quantitative numbers of plays don't get very high ratings. And so that could really hurt you with a label. On the other hand, I'm thinking about like, they have like a hyper pop playlist on Spotify. They have like a kind of really small comparative overall numbers, but of the people that listen to it, they get a lot of really intense fandom. So it kind of measures the quality of that attention. So I think that it really kind of goes in all different directions. It does help to have big data, but also that can kind of hurt you sometimes too.
Awesome, thanks AJ. We'll have to move on to Madeleine now, but there's some questions in the chat, so feel free to respond to those if you want to. And I'll definitely recommend people check out AJ's paper, Hip Hop for Scholarly Communication, and I've actually put together a YouTube playlist of the tracks in that one, so I'm going to post that in the chat as well, so it's worth a listen. So yeah, next up we've got Madeleine Pownall, and her talk is Open Science, Open to All, an Early Career Perspective. So Madeleine is a PhD researcher and lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of Leeds in the UK. Madeleine is a feminist social psychologist and open science advocate. She specialises in gender, sexism and stereotyping. Madeleine sits on the BPS Psychology of Women and Equalities Committee and is co-author of A Feminist Companion to Social Psychology, which is forthcoming this year with the Open University Press. She's particularly interested in discussions surrounding the inclusivity, diversity and representation of open science. So I'll hand it over to you, Madeleine.
Hello. Can you see my slides okay? Are they full screen?
Not full screen yet.
Oh no. Are they full screen now?
There you go, yeah, all good.
Okay, fab. Hi everyone. So I guess two disclosures first. Number one, I'm really sorry Kanye West isn't in this talk. That last talk, AJ, that was amazing. I like clapped at the end like I was in an actual conference. I thought that was fascinating and a really, really hard act to follow. I hope you don't find this really boring. That's disclosure number one. Disclosure number two, I have a horrendous cold. So I'm going to try and get through this without like coughing and sneezing. So please excuse me if I have to take water breaks. I'm going to try and get through this. This is the most talking I've done today. Okay, hello. Is open science open to all is what I'm going to be talking about, with a particular focus on early career researchers. And this talk is longer than just me saying no. So we'll get into it. So just very quickly, hello. You can call me Maddie. I am myself an early career researcher, so I'm doing my PhD and it's like ending soon, like I'm writing up my thesis now. As Carly said, I'm a social psychologist, so everything that I kind of talk about will have some kind of flavour of psychology and a bit of social psychology as well. Yeah, so that's me. That's supposed to look like me. So it doesn't really, that's me. So I'm first going to be giving a kind of early career perspective or multiple early career perspectives on the whole open science, open research, open scholarship conversation. I'm then going to be talking a little bit about whether open science is compatible necessarily with all kinds of science and all kinds of knowledge. And then we'll kind of end with a very brief look to what the future of this might look like. And I've got quite a lot to cover, and I think it's I'm really interested in like Q&A, so I'll go through, and then if there's stuff you want to kind of recap with me, we can do. Okay, so early career researchers. So we know from the literature, we know from conferences, we know from Twitter that early career researchers, so people who are just getting started in their kind of scholarly career, are really championing open science. So there's an awful lot of community organisations, grassroots organisations that are led by early career researchers, that were started by early career researchers. There was this really interesting statistic. So Chris Chambers said on Twitter recently that around 80% of registered reports, which is this kind of open science initiative where people have their you have your paper reviewed before results, before you collect any data, in an effort to reduce publication bias and questionable research practices, that around 80% are first authored by early career researchers. So I see all the time in papers and in discussions and at these kind of events that early career researchers are kind of leading the way for some of these initiatives, which is fab, right? However, we also know that early career researchers are we're kind of at the bottom of the food chain, kind of like the academic food chain. Like early career researchers, we have all kinds of really unique pressures, like power. You know, I can speak about open science and the need for open science until I'm blue in the face, but if I don't have autonomy and power to do anything about it, then things fall a little bit flat. Precarity, so most ECRs, not all, but some ECRs are in precarious employment, so it might be fixed term employment, it might be temporary contracts. So that's a kind of other issue, the precarity that ECRs face, and this wider issue more broadly of politics. So I'm going to be talking in a few slides about how the kind of supervisor-student relationship might also kind of lend different unique pressures. So this raises some interesting questions, well, questions that I think are interesting, such as, so how can we make sure that all early career researchers get a seat at the open science table? And as I was writing that in my slides, I then thought, well, what is the open science table? Do we want to be part of this table? Whose table is it anyway? And these are some of the questions that I've think about all the time and have written about recently in the paper that I share in the slide here. So these are some of the questions that I want to kind of think about. So just to flag, so I've mentioned this paper, I'm going to talk throughout the next couple of slides about early career researchers generally, so all early career researchers in all different fields, in all different epistemologies. I wanted to flag this paper because I think it was this paper that got me the invite, so it felt wrong to not flag this. That in this paper, we also consider how early career researchers who adopt methods and epistemologies and research agendas that are kind of already kept separate from the mainstream. So it might be critical approaches to mainstream psychology or whatever field you're in, feminist ways of doing things, decolonized ways of doing things, that all of these barriers and all of these pressures for early career researchers just may be heightened when you are operating in a subfield that is already kind of marginalized. So we talk about that in a load of detail in this paper, but for the purpose of these next couple of slides, I'm talking about early career researchers from all epistemologies and all research backgrounds. But we can talk about this more if you want, because I think it's really interesting. Okay, so I speak to an awful lot of early career researchers day to day, my kind of peers, about open science. What I've done recently, which I think is quite a nice way to frame this talk, is myself and some of my PhD friends who typically have long coffee chats talking about open science, decided, okay, so let's actually ask people what they think about this. Let's try and figure out what are the barriers to engaging in open science, whether they're actual barriers or perceived barriers, what are the benefits, and just generally what are early career researchers in psychology, I'm just talking about psychology for the purpose of this, in the UK, what are we thinking about open science? So this was a project that we're just wrapping up now that was led by Lizzie Collins, who's at the University of Stirling. And we asked a load of early career researchers free text questions about their experiences of open science, their barriers, the costs, all kinds of things. And what I find really interesting is that ECRs were generally talking about these two distinct things. They were either saying, well, why on earth would I engage with open science? Why would I go through the process of doing this? Does it kind of confer advantages? Are there disadvantages? And it led to this broader question of, we're talking about open science like it's a given good thing, but what else does it maybe open up in the process? Like, what could we need to be wary of when we have less power, precariousness and there's politics involved. And the other kind of message that was coming through is ECRs who were talking about a barrier being the very practical, logistical, I don't know what I'm doing type thing. So I'm going to go through these kind of core 2 messages in a bit more detail. So to first get us thinking about this idea of what does open science open up in the process, I'm going to share with you a quote from a participant where they talked about this. And I think it kind of broke my heart a bit, but I think it's a really, really good quote to illustrate this. So I won't read the whole thing, but I'll read some bits. So they were saying, so open science is great, fine, but we need to do it with kindness and inclusivity. So they were talking about how there's people online who are horrible to researchers, and this kind of being horrible comes under the guise of, oh, it's good for science, it's open science. And people are just making honest mistakes, and it kind of leads to this fear of being punished for making a mistake, and being wrapped up in the kind of hostility of correcting science. And this came through really, really, really strongly in the data that we collected, which I think is interesting and a fairly urgent problem to think about, I think. So other people have talked about this. Other people quite recently have considered how the kind of moral argument for open science and it's good for science, and this is, we want to be able to correct and self-correct, may also lead to increased vulnerabilities, particularly for certain groups of researchers. So there's a term that Kirsty Whitaker and Olivia Guest coined, which I think is part hilarious and part tragic, which is, they talk a lot, and there's a paper that I can link you to, about this idea of broken science, which broadly refers to exactly what this participant is talking about. So this kind of culture that sometimes coexists with open science that is under the guise of kind of scholarly development, but is actually kind of looks like hostility, unkindness, and elitism. And I think that this idea of broken science raises some really important questions that I don't think are that clear-cut to address. And it also raises this really important tension between, we want stuff that's good for the science, like we want the science to be good and reliable and able to inform policy and all that kind of lovely stuff. But we also, if that then leads to negative experiences or disadvantages for the researchers, then there's a tension there that we kind of need to address. Yeah. So this is another quote that, again, I won't read out. And I think that this quote from a participant also kind of emulates that second message that was coming through our data, which was where participants were saying, I'm completely on board with open science. I think that all of this stuff is important and necessary, but I don't know how to do it, or my research isn't good enough for me to do it. So this person was saying that they found open science, just generally open science itself, to be daunting. It's reserved for genius researchers doing perfect experimental studies. And this came through a lot in the data that we collected, and also B, in my conversations with other PhD researchers in this space. Of quite often I hear people say things like, oh yeah, well, pre-registration of your hypotheses is wonderful, but I don't know how to do it. Or open data is a great idea, but where on earth do I put it? Like, how do I do it? And to me, this is one of those kind of, it sometimes feels a bit like the elephant in the room of some open science spaces, that there's all these really, really convincing, passionate arguments around what we need to do to improve science, but not a huge amount of consideration around how we actually do it, like how is it done on the ground. So this leads to another need, which is quite an urgent need for proper practical support. So as I was kind of saying, most ECRs or the ECRs that I speak to are well on board with the moral argument for things being lovely and open and transparent and robust, and kind of readily adopting all of these tools that people are talking about. but we need practical support to be able to do that. So for example, I have written and spoken and chatted to other people about how pre-registration, so the act of pre-registering your hypotheses for hypothesis testing research in advance of your data collection, is a wonderful thing. Like, it reduces biases, it reduces p-hacking. It's a good thing, right? Like, and I'm kind of on board with that. It's great for science, we love it. But the first pre-registration I ever did is like unusable. It was dreadful because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to answer the questions on the OSF template. And so the whole thing was kind of rendered a bit useless. And I think that this is quite a nice example of being on board with the concept of open science, but needing support with the implementation. And another thing that was coming through in this data, and again is something that I hear quite a bit in early career spaces, is not only just the need for support, but also the huge amount of variability in the support that people experience. So it kind of links back to that thing I was talking about in the beginning about politics, about how politics and power are wrapped up here. So a few of these are some quotes from some of the people who responded to our questions around what are the barriers. And people were saying, oh, well, it's great. You know, one person said, oh, well, I've got a friend who's doing her PhD with a supervisor who's like an open scientist and like gets it and is on board and provides that support. But I'm not, and I don't know how to do it. And I feel like even just an appreciation or an acknowledgement of how variable the support is that early career researchers have in this space feels like a kind of positive step forward, because I see all kinds of really well-intentioned, really, really beautifully written papers and guides around trying to empower early career researchers to adopt these practices, that doesn't always come with a kind of proper explicit appreciation of how variable support can be. And another thing that I'm not going to talk about too much, but we can definitely chat about if this is something that interests you, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot more recently, is I sometimes feel like in open science spaces that we kind of take it as a given that participation in open science is the goal for all researchers. And actually, the more that I've been working with people who are doing qualitative research and people who are doing particularly kind of creative, what do I mean, like creative co-creation of research with communities, for example, I think that there's also a conversation to be had around, before we try and kind of make open science applicable to everyone, are there some research paradigms or research approaches that are just kind of not really compatible with the kind of goals of open science? So like, I think a really nice example of this is there's been loads of conversations about reproducibility and wanting our results to be able to be reproduced by other people. In qualitative data, in some qualitative data, because of things like reflexivity and subjectivity and lived experience, data or findings just aren't going to reproduce, and that's kind of okay. So what I'd like to see, my shiny vision for science, is a more kind of thorough appreciation of also there are some types of research that just might not fit in this conversation that we've been having, which is important as well for early career researchers as they try to grapple with this space. Again, I won't talk about this too much because this came from a coffee and a chat I had with someone about open science and qualitative research, and I think it is just the perfect way of looking at it. So there's been a few people who have kind of tried to push for, instead of the idea that you have to do all the open science stuff all at once, and that it's a kind of one size fits all, do open science, whatever that might mean, that instead we should think of open science as a buffet. So you can take what you need. There'll be some bits that aren't compatible with the research you're doing, some bits that you just don't want, like you don't want that bit. and you can engage with this buffet as much as makes sense for the research that you're doing. Or, as he said, this is with Pete Branney from Bradford, who does great work in qualitative open science. Or he said, you might want to ignore the buffet altogether and pick up a sandwich on your way home, which I think is a great way of putting it in terms of epistemologies that might not marry up with the goals of open science. So I promised you some talk about the future. I think that there's some exciting stuff happening. To me, the solution, like the only, not the only, but the solution that I'm really passionate about is to embed proper explicit training about open science practices almost from like day dot, like day one. So I've done some work with Fort, who are amazing. They're an amazing organisation. The Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training, led by ECRs, funnily enough, on how to make it easier for educators and people who support student education, make it easier to embed these conversations around open science, how to do it, practical hands-on guides, at the kind of grassroots level. So like a welcome to your degree, welcome to your research training. This is how you can start to think about that. And I'm more than happy to chat more about this as well, because it's a kind of passion project of mine at the moment. I'm kind of getting to the end of my talk now, but I wanted to flag some of the amazing work. Most of these are in psychology, but not always. So there's SIPS, the Society for Improvement of Psychological Science, which kind of hosts a lot of these conversations. The Riot Science Club, which is led by ECRs, Fort that I've mentioned. And there was a special issue of the journal Psychology of Women Quarterly, that was a special issue on feminist psychology and open science that's just been published. And this is the editorial for it. And there's amazing papers in there that are grappling with issues of inclusivity, diversity, representation, intersectionality in open science spaces. Finally, I'm nearly done, sorry. Finally, if any of this stuff interests you, I'm currently running 2 projects alongside my PhD, don't tell my supervisors, 2 projects. One where we're going to look at how open science may confer actual tangible benefits to students. And one where we're going to be looking at whether pre-registration of undergraduate research leads to longitudinal outcomes. And I am on the hunt for collaborators far and wide. They're both massive collaborative projects. So if you want in on any of this, let me know and we can talk more. But finally, sorry if that felt rushed. That is all from me. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the amazing people that I have worked with. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Maddie. That was fantastic. Again, we're open for questions. Pop your hand up and I'll call on you, or pop them in the comment box. I'll kick us off while you do that. Yeah, that was a really interesting point around open science not being a one size fits all across disciplines. And I definitely see that in my work around data sharing with like social science researchers, you know, doing interview work and qualitative stuff. So I wonder, and interesting to your point around registered reports and ECRs leading the way on that. So what do you think? Obviously, open research, it takes in a lot of processes and tools. What would be sort of a good way into open science for ECRs that sort of like has a payoff when faced maybe with a academic progression structure that doesn't really incentivize those things just yet?
Yeah, oh, that's a really, really good question. There was actually a paper that I might try and find and link that was called, I think it's called like 7 Easy Steps to Open Science as Early Career Researchers or something. And they go through the paper and they're like, there's this practice, and then they rank them as like level easy, medium or difficult. Because I think there are some things that are kind of quick wins, if you like, or quicker wins. Like as AJ was talking about, posting work as a preprint, like that's a good kind of quick win. It doesn't require a huge amount of training and investment, and it means that you're getting your work out there, and it's in the spirit of openness and sharing, which is all wonderful. And then at the kind of other end of the spectrum, it's things like registered reports or thank you, Laura, who's put that in the chat. Yeah, easing into open science. That's the paper that I'm talking about. You read my mind. Yeah, because I think that it's definitely a spectrum, and there are some things that are just more difficult to do, particularly in light of those concerns around guidance and support, than others. And I guess that as well as it, I was trying to think of an analogy that it's like a buffet as well, but it also is kind of like a staggered buffet where things get more difficult as in different parts of the buffet, but I couldn't think of a metaphor for that. But yeah, I think that there are quicker, easier wins and also things that require a lot more investment and time.
Yeah, so we've got a question in the chat that is around support actually for these things. So what positive role do you see support staff can play as distinct from supervisors in enabling an open science culture that is hospitable? So I guess we're talking maybe about scholarly communications or, library support perhaps beyond the supervisor.
That's a really good question. I'm really, really fortunate in that so I'm at the University of Leeds, and there's a open research kind of team in the, I think they live in like the library world in my university, who have been amazing to me, like personally. They help me out with things like open access publishing, with trying to get grants for open access publishing, for trying to understand what on earth the whole academic publishing model things are, how preprints work, how copyright works, all of this stuff that I still, to be honest, don't have much of a clue about. But yeah, I think that there are these kind of places where support exists that isn't necessarily just the supervisor, and it's a bit like a Leeds, there's it's called ODPL, what does it stand for? Organisational Development Professional Learning team, and they put on support sessions for all staff, and all students as well, so things around like literature searching, open access, and they kind of cultivate conversations, because I think that a lot of this to me sometimes is just about having space to have the conversation. Yeah, because particularly if there isn't direct supervisory kind of this is how you do it, any place where we can carve out some kind of space to talk about this stuff, I think is really, really beneficial for ECRs.
Yeah, so maybe in the way of, open research groups or that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's like so there's reproducibility, who I've talked about on the slide, who are for early career researchers, and it's just a journal club. Like, it's not training, it's not a support, it's just a club for people to chat about issues, and even things like that I think can be so beneficial to figuring out what on earth you're doing with all this stuff.
Yeah, just having that space. So we've got another question in the chat. So could you talk more about your pre-registration of undergraduate theses project?
Yes, I can. So this was actually a registered report that's received in principal acceptance, and we are going to be looking longitudinal at students who pre-register their dissertation versus students who don't pre-register their dissertation in psychology, whether so there's one time point that's now, and there's one time point that's at the end of their degree, and we want to know whether going through that process of thinking about their analysis prior to doing any kind of data collection and going through the process of pre-registration, whether that confers any advantage for things like statistics anxiety, understanding of open science. So I put a link in the chat to the resources, and you can find the paper that was stage 1 paper, and I'm just interested in collaborators who are going to help to recruit and inform that. So do get in touch if you're one of those people, and we can talk about it a bit more.
Oh, that sounds like a great project. Right, we're a bit over time. We'll take one more. David, you've got your hand up. Feel free to ask your question.
Hello. Yeah, I wanted to ask. I read the paper you spoke at the start that this is based on about, and I was quite interested in the concept of invisible labour and open science. And I intended a talk yesterday at the BL about the hidden ref, and I wonder if you heard of the hidden ref, and if so, if you could talk about the sort of crossovers there between their sort of running of awards for things like training materials and citizen science, community building. To me, this suddenly sparked connections in my mind where I saw this all makes sense all of a sudden. This is what this is a clear way out of what we're in. But I wonder if you had any opinions on that.
Yeah, I think that things like the hidden ref are wonderful. I think it's a solution to try and kind of reward or appreciate or acknowledge all of the hidden labor that goes into this stuff. It's like for the framework for open and reproducible science, the team of, there's a really small team of people who run it, who do like meetings every week and run these projects and write these papers. But a lot of the outputs that Fort are doing aren't the kind of outputs that you can necessarily put on like a promotion application or a job application, because it's the kind of, oh, it's good for community and good for science, but it's not necessarily going to lead to like refable outputs. So I think any attempt at just trying to acknowledge that there are other contributions to science that aren't peer-reviewed refable outputs, I think is the solution. And I think, yeah, the hidden ref work. And I also really like the hidden ref because they look at kind of communities and organizations rather than trying to kind of promote this idea of like, there's these genius people who are doing this groundbreaking stuff. I think anything that's also trying to acknowledge that science is like a team sport is also very welcome to me. Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question. Just yeah.
Thanks.
Amazing. So yeah, I guess we'll have to wrap it up now. We could talk about this all day. Apologies, we're a bit late. We'll blame that on my poor hosting skills. But I'm sure that the conversations can carry on Twitter. So Madeleine's at Maddie MADDI_Pow POW. So yeah, thank you so much, Maddie. That's fantastic, and to AJ as well. I really hope everyone attending enjoyed that as much as I did. It's fantastic. And you can sign up for the rest of the week's events as well. I'll put the link in the chat there. But in the meantime, thanks everyone. Hope to see you later this week.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Bye.
You're welcome.